It's clear high inflation isn't going away anytime soon. But who's to blame? Many are pointing the finger at President Biden, others at Fed Chair Jerome Powell, and still others at large corporations. I'm going to explain what inflation really is, how it works, and who's to blame for the fastest price increases we've seen in decades. Let's get into it. Inflation simply means that prices are being inflated, or rising, and that the pace of that increase is moving quickly. This is measured by economists who track the price of goods and services from one month to the next and compare it to previous periods. And thus, we can see how today's inflation stacks up. Inflation is a bit like a snowball rolling downhill. As prices start to rise for some items, other items that use those items and businesses that rely on them start to raise their prices as well. If this gets out of hand, you can start to see runaway inflation, where prices rise by hundreds or even thousands of percentage points in a year. But that's extremely rare, and generally happens when governments and central banks make big mistakes. But even moderately high inflation has a culprit. And in the US, inflation is rising at an 8.6% annual rate, the fastest it has been in 40 years. So who's to blame? Lots of people point the finger at Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. Legendary economist Milton Friedman famously said, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon." And it's true. The Fed pumped $120 billion a month into the US economy for years, swelling its balance sheet to more than $8 trillion, and around half of that came after March 2020. But prior to 2020, the Fed had used this strategy and inflation remained very low. After 2020 though, the Fed kept interest rates near zero, despite trillions in stimulus spending by the federal government. They are just now beginning to raise interest rates, which increases the cost of borrowing and slows down the economy in an effort to rein in price increases. But rates are still negative today when accounting for inflation. Then there's the president, and the truth is the person in the Oval Office deserves some blame. President Joe Biden signed the American Rescue Plan, which the Congressional Budget Office said would add $1.85 trillion to the US budget deficit. And then there's former President Donald Trump, who signed the $2.3 trillion CARES Act and the $900 billion Consolidated Appropriations Act in December. One way to think of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. And by providing trillions of dollars in money to American households, the president and Congress helped tip the scales on inflation. Trump also nominated Powell to his role as Fed chair, and Biden renominated him last year. So even if inflation is simply a monetary phenomenon, the president picks the person in charge of monetary policy, and therefore has to take a little bit of the blame. Earnings reports show that S&P 500 companies on average are raising their prices by about 20% more than the rate of inflation for wholesale prices. That means that as the prices for their inputs have increased, they've raised the prices by a lot more. Their profit margins are also at record highs. So a good bit of inflation is due to big companies. Don't forget, COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, and other price shocks have played a big role. And finally, there's us, regular working people. Everyday Americans push up inflation in two ways. First, by demanding higher wages from their employer, putting pressure on companies to raise prices to account for rising labor costs. And second, we keep paying higher prices. If consumers stayed home and refused to pay, companies' profits would take a beating and they'd be forced to bring down their prices. But because individuals keep spending, companies keep pushing prices up. The bottom line is, no one person or entity is entirely responsible for inflation. And in fact, you're partially responsible too. The great J. Cole reminds us, they say time is money, but really it's not. If we ever go broke, time is all we got. That's all for now. See you next time.